Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Karen Lloyd. She is the Wrigley Chair in Environmental Studies and Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Southern California. And today we're talking about her book, Intraterrestrials, Discovering the Strangest Life on Earth. So, Dr. Lloyd, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, what are intraterrestrials?
It's not a very commonly used term, but I'm using it to talk about anything that's alive inside Earth. It turns out that it's a kind of a different community than what we experience in our daily lives, different enough that it kind of needs its own name. I didn't come up with that name, but a couple other scientists did, but I find it useful.
And are these all unicellular organisms, or can some of them be multicellular?
For the most part, these are unicellular organisms, so tiny little single-celled microbes. But of course, they interact with each other and they form sort of biofilms with each other. And so then you start to that question of what's a single-celled organism versus what's a tissue, is this a community? So that line gets a little hazy, but also some of my colleagues have found like eukaryotes, so worms, tiny worms buried deeply in Earth's crust as well. So I wouldn't rule out the presence of some small multicellular organisms as well.
Yeah. And what is the subsurface habitat like? I mean, does it vary or not?
Yeah, it's pretty varied all over Earth. I mean, so you can think about Earth as in like layers, and the layer that we're concerned with in our daily lives is where the trees and the sun and the birds and all the things that we experience in our daily life. But we don't often spend a lot of time thinking about what's underneath our feet. And literally where you're standing right now, underneath you is probably some soil, probably some rock. Eventually it gets pretty hot if you keep going straight down from where you are right now. But you and I are in different places, and so what that environment would look like underneath our feet is very different. It would have different amounts of porosity. It would have different types of energetic resources that can support life. It's actually a vastly diverse ecosystem down there.
And how do you go about exhuming living beings from the subsurface?
We go about it in a lot of different ways. It tends to be creative and sometimes desperate. It's hard to get things from inside Earth. So sort of the two main categories as I see it are either we dig down to them or we wait for them to come up to us. And so the digging down to them option is a lot of, we have giant drills and drill ships that we can go out in the ocean and drill underneath the ocean. There's drilling on land, making big boreholes. These are pretty big, a lot of financial and time and expertise resources have to go into doing these sorts of things. Or we can do simpler things like just take a handheld core, like punching a straw into a slushy. There's also sort of waiting for it to come back up to us. There's a lot of natural springs that are deeply sourced. So you can go to like one place in Canada has some waters that are gushing up slowly from a giant underground aquifer that have not seen the light of day for over 1 billion years, which I just still have trouble even understanding the magnitude of that.
Yeah. And since they tend to be, or for the most part, they are unicellular, and they are so small, how do you see them? What kinds of techniques do you employ?
So we use a lot of DNA techniques is probably our number one way of getting at these things, because if you spread them out on a petri dish or you put them in some liquid medium and wait for them to start growing, like maybe they don't know how to react to what you've given them to eat. So you can't expect them to do that. So we, generally speaking, kill them. The first thing we do is kill them. Don't worry, there's literally billions and billions. They're all right. And then we crack them open and take out their DNA. But we also, since we found DNA to be so useful in reconstructing their lives, we try to take all the biomolecules that we can. So we take RNA, we take proteins, we take small metabolites, lipids. whatever we can do to sort of pick apart what these things' lives are. And then we measure all the chemicals around them too, and sort of put those two things together and say, okay, there's genes to eat a certain chemical. Do we see evidence that that chemical is being eaten? That kind of thing.
And how do they breathe, quote unquote, in these environments? And I mean, what corresponds to their breathing?
Yeah, breathing is a tough word. It's what they do is they take breathing down to its most essential chemical details. We associate breathing with inspiration, lungs, taking air into our lungs. And that's true, of course. But they show that that's not the important part of breathing. The important part, even for us, of breathing is when those tiny chemicals that are carried in our blood reach the oxygen that's that comes into our lungs. And the actual respiration part of this is that chemical reaction that we have in our own bodies with electron-rich chemicals from our food and oxygen. And so since these organisms sort of, I don't want to say they realize that, but they make use of the fact that that's all that respiration is. It doesn't depend on oxygen. It doesn't depend on air. They will do that chemical reaction with lots and lots of chemicals. So that really cracks open the possibilities for breathing, for life, to extend to almost everything in the middle of the periodic table can be breathed by something on life, on Earth. Any chemical or element that is capable of giving up an electron or receiving an electron is probably going to be used by life to breathe. And they even go so far as to not even use chemicals in some cases. They just break it down to its barest essentials, which is really just the movement of electrons, and they can work with electrons directly.
Mm-hmm. And some of them even breathe, so to speak, rocks, right?
Yeah. So these solid surfaces are great places in the subsurface. I mean, if there's one thing that the subsurface is rich with, it's rocks, right? It's made up of rocks. And so that's nice because it's a nice place to settle. It's a nice place to sort of hang out, and a home that you can make for yourself if you're a subsurface being. But also the rocks are often made of these metals like iron that are really good at either accepting an electron or donating an electron. And so they can do that right there with the rocks around them. So it's kind of like they're breathing their house.
And how do they have access to energy?
So they, if you think about rock and you think about trying to live in rock, it may seem like nothing really happens. But actually things do happen. Fluids move around. We have earthquakes. There's ways to make new chemicals. So there is sources of energy that are geological sources of energy that have nothing to do with sunlight. Our main form of energy up here is sunlight. And then the things that come from that later, like the breakdown of the plants, the food that the plants make for us. But they are instead dependent upon geological sources of all these chemicals.
How do they play with thermodynamics? I mean, how does it work in their case?
Yeah, so thermodynamics is not something that we talk about a lot with biology. And that's the fact that we don't talk about it with biology is instructive. We don't talk about it that much. I mean, there are parts of biology that do. I don't want to say that no one does, but it's just not in our common parlance. We think of it more as like a chemistry or a physics thing. But the reason that we don't talk about it that much, at least for respiration, is that our thermodynamics as these beings that we are quite boring. Like, we just have a ton of energy. We're not energy limited. Our food will always, as long as we have access to food and air, we will always get energy from it. These beings, these subsurface beings, live at the edge of what's thermodynamically possible. They are getting energy from tiny, tiny little quanta of energy that are so small that if something changes about their environment, then the same food that gave them energy yesterday, even when it's present, will not give them energy today. And that is just something that it's a situation for which we have no analog in our lives. Like, a hamburger is always going to give you energy as long as you can breathe. But for them, that can switch on them. And I find that really fascinating.
Mhm. In what ways would you say these beings change our conception of life?
So we have this assumption that, I shouldn't speak for other people. I sort of have this implicit assumption in my own head that everything does need sunlight and everything does need oxygen, because that really is what drives everything up here. But these intraterrestrials show us that actually there's a whole nother world that can exist without sunlight and without the dead things falling down. I mean, they use the dead bodies that fall down for sure, but that they can get by without it as well. They can do all the same things without any inputs from the surface world. And that is the notion that that life extends that deeply into the realm of chemistry and into the realm of physics is something that changes my way of thinking for sure.
Does the existence of these intraterrestrials have any implications for what we know about the evolutionary relationships among all life on Earth?
So one of the weirdest things that we found when we first started looking at DNA that we pull out of these deep environments was that the DNA that we were pulling out did not match the DNA of anything we'd ever seen before. I was there for this. This was one of my first projects as a PhD student in the early 2000s, was trying to, I was pulling these DNA sequences out of some deep subsurface samples. And I was like, okay, am I going to have this kind of proteobacteria, or am I going to have a firmicute? Is it going to be gram positive? Is it going to be gram negative? All these things that I learned about microbiology. And what it was none of that. It was totally independent. It was so weird that I thought I was screwing it up. Because when you're first starting out, that's always, I see this in my own students. Their first thought is, well, I just messed it up somehow. Let's throw it all away and start over. Like, wait, don't throw it away. You're doing a good job. So one reason why I knew that it wasn't me who was screwing up is that it matched almost perfectly to what my colleagues were getting in Japan and what other colleagues were getting in New Jersey and different places all around the world and the UK. And so when you string together like 1,500, that's how long this gene is, 1,500 A, G, C, T, T, G, C, if you get that order almost exactly the same between what I'm getting in the Gulf of Mexico and what somebody's getting in Japan, that didn't happen by accident. I didn't screw up and they didn't screw up. We're both looking at something real, but it's something that no one's ever seen before. And what we now know, is that this is a new deep branch. There's many, many new deep branches on the tree of life. And we have so many more relatives than we ever knew that we did on this planet.
So I would like to ask you now about the kinds of organisms that we can find across different kinds of environments, just for people to also have a better understanding of exactly what we're talking about here. So what kinds of life have you found on the sea floor, and particularly in methane seeps?
Yeah, so methane seeps are a great source of energy for microbiota. Methane can interact with sulfate, it can interact with iron, it can interact with oxygen to do all these different respirations. So we tend to see a lot of energetic things happening at methane seeps at the bottom of the sea. So if you go down in a submersible in the Atlantic basin, in the middle of the Atlantic, and you drop down, it's just kind of be a sandy looking muddy bottom without much going on. You might see a couple of things, but if you drop down onto a methane seep, you're going to see teeming life, crabs and worms that are so dependent upon the microbial interaction with these chemicals that they actually don't have mouths anymore. They don't even try to eat normal worm food. They just bring in chemicals for these little intraterrestrials that live inside their bodies, and those microbes then will make food for the worm. They're completely dependent upon it.
How about the Arctic permafrost? What kinds of organisms can we find there?
We're really just starting to work on permafrost, I would say, because it's often quite inaccessible. It's buried underneath layers of soil. So you have to drill down to it for the most part. Sometimes when it slumps, as it's thawing from climate change, we can kind of get at it from the side, which can be useful as well. So what we're seeing from this is that actually there seem to be a lot of things that live in permafrost, even very ancient permafrost. And that's not a new idea. This is some colleagues of mine in Russia for maybe 20 years ago came up with this concept of these brines. So as you freeze, if you take just soil with water in it and it freezes, then the water that freezes into ice is freezing as pure water, like H2O, which leaves any salts that were like, even fresh water will have like a little bit of salts in it. That will then get concentrated in the remaining liquid water, such that as you increase, as you make more and more ice, at some point the leftover water is salty enough that it actually lowers its freezing point. And so now this briny water that's left over never freezes. So it's below zero. It can be -5, -10, but it's liquid. And so these organisms do live in permafrost slowly. They're not doing much, but as far as we can tell, they're alive in permafrost.
Another place that I would imagine people would not think it would be possible to find life there is the bottom of active volcanoes. So what can we find there exactly?
So I do not, well, I have not, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying that we're finding life in lava. So lava is too hot for life that we know. I won't discount that life can be made of other things than carbon, but carbon-based life is going to burn up in lava. But the nice thing about volcanoes is that they are the ultimate source of good geological food and nutrients coming up to the surface. And so they bring with them carbon dioxide, nitrogen compounds, so much sulfur compounds, and iron. There's just a lot of really important biological elements that are brought up by volcanoes from the deep earth. And so what you'll see is when it gets cool enough on the edges of volcanoes, even down at the base of them, even very close to the inside of them, we see life just creeping in wherever it can to make use of all that good stuff until it erupts and is killed.
And as far as you explore in your book, there's also life, or there can also exist life in boiling water, pure acid, and bleach, right? I mean, those are, at least they sound like extreme conditions.
Yeah, it's wild. The first time I started working on hyperthermophiles is what we call the ones that live in 100 degrees. If you've ever done like a lab class or something and you had to make media, you maybe made an agar plate, you had to be very careful to be sterile, right? Like you didn't want to contaminate your medium. So that's how we do it. That's how we make media. And it's such a strange cognitive dissonance to be, holding these, being so careful with media preparation and, being so loving and making sure that there's everything these organisms need to live. And then when you inoculate it, when you have a hyperthermophile, you throw it in a vat of boiling water. And it just feels so weird. I mean, it's in a tube, right? So it's not like the water doesn't get inside the thing, but it's so weird to be like spending time nurturing this precious little thing. And then you just like dunk it in boiling water. But if you don't do that, it's not going to grow. And so it's really amazing. They just need things to be that hot. Otherwise, their enzymes don't really work right.
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah, right. In your book, you also talk about how some of them can live for hundreds or even thousands of years or longer. How can they do that?
Yeah, this is something we are definitely still working on. Proving that is hard. We can do a lot with variables. We can make all kinds of temperatures. We can make all kinds of pressures in our labs. There are geologists who make ultra high pressures. They can basically recreate some of the pressures deep inside Earth, inside their own laboratories, which is amazing. But we can't manipulate time. So we cannot run an experiment for 1,000 years or even 100,000 years, that we would need to replicate this. So we think that they live for that long because we find them in places where we know that no material has moved in and out for, 100,000 years or so. And we can see that they're alive, and we can see the waste products that they've made, and we can look at the rate at which they've been breathing, and we can use thermodynamics to calculate how much energy that they had. And when we add all that up and we compare it to the amount of energy that it would take to create a baby, it doesn't work. They can't do it. There's not enough energy there to ever have divided. And we look at their genes, we don't see a lot of evidence that they're evolving over 100,000 years, which if something's growing normally, 100,000 years is plenty of time to make something happen. And we don't see evidence of big evolutionary changes over these times. So our best guess is that they're just not growing for that long.
But how is it that they evolved to stop growing for that long?
We don't really know the answer to that either. But in my book, I get very speculative about it because you have to. Like, what are you going to do? Yeah. These things exist. This seems to be true. Everything I learned about evolution was about fast, like speed, be the one to reproduce faster. We know that that's not always the case. If you look at shrimp growing in the ocean, they reproduce quickly versus an elephant, which reproduces slowly and lives a long time. So we have words for these, R strategists and K strategists in ecology. But still an elephant is not going to live 1,000 years. There's a couple of trees that will live for 1,000 years, maybe a few thousand, but their individual cells turn over much faster than that. So the idea that there would be a living cell that would live for that long is definitely not something that Charles Darwin thought about. I think I feel pretty confident in saying he never had to work out how that fit into natural selection. So now we're faced with this problem, and I would really like to not reject Darwin, because I think that would get me in some trouble. But you have to think, okay, should we reject Darwin, or are these things actually doing natural selection? And I can imagine that, to make sure that Darwin's okay, we can do natural selection with these things based on something that they experience in the far, far future. So if you are an intraterrestrial, you don't really have much to eat, nothing's really going on, you're getting buried slowly in the seafloor, it just seems like a one-way trip to hell. You're never going to come back. You're just going to die down there. You maybe get buried in the mantle. But actually, if you can wait for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, then actually you could come back up after an earthquake, or you could come back up in a volcano, not in the lava, not in the magma parts, but you can get sort of flushed out of the sides of it. Or as these sediments pile up when continents collide into each other. So I think that there could be evolutionary drivers that happen on geological timescales, which is really, really hard to think about as a biologist.
Do these life forms tell us anything about the origins of life on Earth?
So one thing that's important when we think about how life originated on Earth, if it did in fact originate on Earth, is that we have to think about what is life, like what are the full range of life. And so one way that these things help us think about that is that they do tell us about what all is there. So life can be very, very slow. Life can function on very, very low energy delivery gradients. And so those two facts really expand our notion of like what kinds of things could support early life on Earth. And they actually get us a bit into the second law of thermodynamics, which is that entropy must always increase. And that fact really seems to be driving a lot of what life is. And so in a way, they sort of help us see life as more of a process than like a cell. Like the fact that these things are living cells is sort of not the point. The point of them is that they are doing a better job of increasing entropy in an open system over longer and longer timescales. And I think that's, by taking that view, we can sort of think about the origin of life a little differently.
But as far as we know, where and how did life first form on Earth?
We don't know. Anybody who says they know does not know. Yeah. I've heard people have fights over this, like, oh, it couldn't have formed there, it has to form here, it definitely formed here. And like, at the end of the day, we truly, truly don't know. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it and, do our best to imagine it. But I mean, I think that the subsurface is at least in the running for a good place to form life. It's protected from a lot of the harsh things that happen up at the surface of the Earth, like bombardment and radiation from the sun. But also, it just offers all these diverse gradients. So there's just many, many different chemicals sitting at different redox states. And so if a variety of energy sources at very low power are advantageous to sort of getting this nascent life going, then the subsurface is got to be a great place to do it.
And as far as we know, is there any depth at which life ceases to exist?
I would say there has to be, but I don't know where it is. Right now, 8 kilometers is kind of our record, but it's just basically because we haven't really dug much deeper than that. It's hard. It's hard to dig down very deep, despite, movies like The Core, which is a really, really fun movie. But, the people in it they physically go down to the core. Like, we can't do that. Even though we know a lot about the core and the mantle and the crust of Earth, we know that mostly from seismics and from rocks that sort of get popped up on land and analyzing their chemicals. We've never been to the mantle.
Right. But what are the limits, really? I mean, do we know what are the conditions in which life can really no longer exist?
So some people think, and I think this is a good idea, that temperature is going to be the ultimate limiter. Just the point at which things incinerate is, as I said, lava is a no-go. So you definitely get to lava temperatures within the crust for sure. But the thing about temperature is that it could be offset by pressure, because high temperature disorders things and pressure pushes them back together again. So it is possible that under high pressures, you could actually extend the temperature range over which life can be found too. So the only thing I know about the ultimate depth at which we'll find that life ceases to exist is that we have not hit it yet.
Mm-hmm. How much of life on Earth do you think we have yet to discover?
Well, at every moment, it sort of feels like, okay, we're pretty much done now. We're slowing down. I don't discover a new phylum every day anymore. That used to be a daily occurrence, and now it's, maybe once every few years or something. It feels like we may be slowing down, but then I remind myself, people would have said the same thing in the 70s, like, oh, we've pretty much nailed it, and they didn't even know about the subsurface at that point. So I imagine that when we get a new way of looking for life, we're going to discover a whole new axis of life that I can't even imagine right now.
In terms of the potential applications that these life forms might have, can they help us fight climate change, for example?
Yeah, so they are very much involved in our climate and regulating our climate in a natural way over long time scales. But if we want to interact with them more immediately, there are very credible technologies on the books to bury carbon, to sequester it out of the atmosphere and sort of lock it away underground. And if that becomes a valid strategy, it will never be the silver bullet. We are going to have to also decrease emissions and do all the other good things that we need to do. If that becomes a strategy for mitigating climate change, it will only be successful if we do so with the knowledge that there are living things down there and they're going to help or hurt. But we can't act like this is a sterile Tupperware container and we can just like throw things down there and out of sight, out of mind, because somebody's down there and they might spit them back at us. So we've got to pay attention to the microbes when we do this.
And what other kinds of applications do they have?
So right now, I am a firm believer that we have not used them to their maximum usefulness for humans. The fact that we are seeing such new types of life means that they've followed their biomolecules, their proteins have been under evolutionary pressures that are totally foreign to the rest of us. And so they probably have really cool things that their enzymes do. Like the first thing that I can think of is high stability. So they should make enzymes that last for a long time because that's a good adaptation to low energy. And for years, humans have been using proteins taken out of microbes or out of animals to, do biotechnology with or biomedicine. And if we start looking at some things from the subsurface, maybe we can find ones that operate a little bit better, more efficiently, with higher affinity for substrates, or maybe they hang out on our, maybe they can be allowed to be transported without refrigeration, which would save a ton of money or make technology accessible to places that don't have reliable electricity.
Looking into the future, what do you think life will look like, and how can we know that?
Where, here? Or
yes, on Earth. Yeah.
On Earth. Okay. So I think that we are going to be less lonely, because I do think that we're going to find life elsewhere. I think we just must. But life on Earth going forward, I know this is like unnecessarily sunny, but I think we're going to be fine. I think we're going to figure out a way to not poison ourselves. We're just working through it right now, and it's messy and it's not good. And we are, all the climate alarm bells are the way to go. Like feeling alarmed is helpful because then we will be moved to action. But it's really, we are going to find a way as a species to interact, to recognize that we're not outside of nature, that we're part of it. And we're part of this continuum, even with these strange beings that seem to live for maybe 1 million years, and their genes look nothing like our genes. They look enough like our genes to know that we are related to them. And I think we're going to figure out how to live with them better.
When it comes to finding life on other planets, what do intraterrestrials tell us about what life might look like?
So the first thing that they do is that they expand the area over which we can search for life within our solar system or outside. So we spend a lot of time looking at the surface of planets just out of necessity, and planetary bodies, because that's the part that we can get at. But if you peel off the layers of, every planet and moon in this solar system, and then every planet and moon in all the galaxies all around the universe, now you've really compounded the area over which life can exist. And so I think that subsurface life may be extremely common in our universe. We just have to find it. It's hard.
And in what ways do you think we should perhaps expand the range of conditions where life might exist across the universe to try to find it?
I think that when we think about Goldilocks planets, so we right now think about planets that are close enough to a warm star, but not too hot of a star to allow liquid water at their surface. That's sort of our criteria for it. This, like Kepler's criteria for an Earth-like planet. But you could put in models that say, okay, well, now like 3 kilometers down, is it close enough to the star, and is the star bright enough to allow, and not too bright to allow liquid water? I think that you would have a lot more Earth-like planets to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So the book is again Intraterrestrials, Discovering the Strangest Life on Earth. I will be leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Lloyd, apart from the book, where can people find your work on the internet?
So I gave a couple of TED Talks a little while ago, so you can just Google Karen Lloyd TED Talk. They come up. I put a ton of work into them, so hopefully you find them entertaining. And I just I don't know. I need to figure out how to be on Instagram. I'm not good, guys. I'm gonna work on it. I'm gonna try to share. I'm headed to the Arctic in September, and I'll try to share that with people better.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
You as well. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters. Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.